Welcome to the first, actually, in this year's Ethics at Noon series, which is sponsored by the Sierra Health Foundation and the Ethics Across the Professions Initiative grant. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Paul Paton. I head the grant, and it's my real personal as well as professional pleasure to welcome Paul Cadario to McGeorge. Paul and I actually went back over the okay, where did we know each other in the mists of time thing, and it dates back actually to 1987-88 when I was a student at the University of Toronto being recruited by Johns Hopkins at Georgetown, and Paul was at that point heading the University of Toronto's Alumni Association with links to the International Relations faculty at the University of Toronto. We later served together on the Governing Council at the University of Toronto, and Paul's links to U of T have actually been renewed because he was appointed in May this year as the Distinguished Senior Fellow in Global Innovation at the University of Toronto, as well as being cross-appointed in civil engineering. And I'll talk to him a little bit about, and the way that this session is going to work is actually more interactive, more Q&A. But one of the things I want to cover is, well, what is exactly a Distinguished Senior Fellow in Global Innovation, and what do we need to be looking for in terms of multidisciplinary approaches that involve engineers and lawyers and others looking at some of those issues, and where is innovation happening at the World Bank? The World Bank is meeting to talk about strategy. Paul's been actually quoted and cited and getting all sorts of responses in the Twitterverse about those issues, and so we'll cover some ground today that talks about ethics at the World Bank, ethics in an international organization that has at times been really controversial and not necessarily respected internationally, whether if the foundation exists for that or not, for engaging in ethical engagement with the countries in which it's doing projects. Paul brings 37 years of experience at the World Bank, and I'll just talk a little bit about some of the titles that he's held there and those roles. As senior manager for the World Bank, he reported to the World Bank's chief financial officer, overseeing quality assurance and compliance, policies, process, and risk management issues associated with a $40 billion, that's with a B, trust fund portfolio and $7 billion in annual disbursements by the bank, providing conceptual and streamlined strategic leadership process for streamlining processes in the bank for efficiency, working with bank policy and legal staff on the negotiations, and basically the reshaping of internally and some of the external face of the bank. That comes after a long career of service at the bank in various capacities. As Chief Administrative Officer, responsible for oversight of a $175 million budget for World Bank activities in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, at a time of incredible change in the early 1990s. He had been the Chief of the Institutional Development Unit for Asia, had been in the Asian and Pacific Regional Office, had been the Principal Country Officer in China and Mongolia as well. And so what we're going to do with this lunch talk is actually have Paul introduce a little bit about his role at the bank, because the Ethics at Noon series in part tries to introduce people to who's doing what professionally, where do ethics matter in those environments, and kind of how did you get to where you are by way of your moral compass. We'll talk about Richard Gere, because Richard Gere actually matters when it comes to the World Bank, surprisingly enough, and a few other stories that Paul has brought along after a very long and distinguished career. So continue to help yourself to sandwiches and cookies. We'll be sitting at the front and having a dialogue until about 1:45, but at any point if there are any questions, and I know that some of you will have classes that you need to head off to, please feel free to interject and we'll just work that into the conversation. This is meant to be an informal dialogue with our guest for today. So please please join me in welcoming Paul Cadario.
Thank you very much, Paul. There's nothing more awful than a PowerPoint presentation while you're eating sandwiches. So I'm just going to, I think Professor Paton and I just thought of, there are two slides here that might be relevant rather than the ones that were there. First, because not all of you may be familiar with the World Bank, and I really should say World Bank Group. It was part of the international financial architecture that was agreed in the closing days of World War II. The World Bank, the IMF, and what eventually became the World Trade Organization were agreed as part of the way that the world would recover and indeed put in place the processes to avoid what had sort of led up to the depression and sort of seizing up the international financial system. We have the World Bank, which lends mainly to middle-income countries. There's IDA, the International Development Association, that World Bank's fund for the very poorest. We have the International Finance Corporation, which does private sector activity without government guarantee, and sort of operates like sort of an investment bank, not quite. We have over 10,000 staff in Washington and probably about 120 country offices now. In the mid-90s, Jim Wolfenson, a former investment banker, rebranded the bank and international development as our dream is a world free of poverty. If you go into the World Bank's headquarters, which are blocked from the White House, you see that on the wall when you come in and the flags. Things had gotten a little out of kilter during the Asian and Latin America financial crises, where it wasn't quite clear what development did. The role of the World Bank and the IMF had gotten a little blurry. Jim Wolfenson focused on poverty and the removal, the eradication of extreme poverty, and basically anticipated some of the work that was done by the United Nations, the international community, that led to the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000, which, despite some uneven progress, has managed to cut the number of people living in absolute poverty in half, even now, although 2015 isn't here, largely through the efforts of China and India. And there's been significant progress on the education, the maternal health, the water goals, not because of the World Bank, but the World Bank operating in partnership with other actors in the international system, and because of good policies in a number of the governments that have a lot of poor people, China and India being the main ones, but there has been great progress in Africa as well. More needs to be done, and the post-millennium, the post-MGE period is now being discussed. The World Bank has had a very strong anti-corruption stance since the mid-90s, and that will come up in a couple of discussions that Professor Paton and I will have. In last July, a year ago in July, the World Bank got a new president, Jim Yong Kim, whose background before he was president of Dartmouth was in global health. First setting up an NGO, which did a lot of community-based development in a number of countries in Latin America, and then at the World Health Organization, where he was in charge of the 3x5 program to advance the use of antiretrovirals in the global battle against AIDS. So he has rebranded the bank now to eradicating absolute poverty by 2030 and enhancing shared prosperity, which is meant to give an entree, we think, into talking about inequality between countries and within countries, and not just poor countries. Because there's emerging evidence that inequality leads to lower economic growth. And that's a fairly gutsy thing to do. The World Bank is now engaged, as Paton mentioned, I have been in the blogosphere and on Twitter, with a new strategy and a reorganization, which looks as if it's going to be very messy, and probably a new financing plan, which, according to an exclusive interview this morning, subsequently replicated live with Richard Quest on CNN, which I didn't see, to cut $400 million a year out of the bank's budget. We'll see. Anyway, so that's the World Bank, just in a nutshell, for those of you, just some little context for what we're going to talk about. Right.
We said informal, so let's, in terms of the dialogue around the World Bank, let's go to corruption right now, because there is this sense or sensibility that there's corruption at two different levels. One is the corruption of an international development ideal, that the U.S. basically is using the World Bank for its own hegemonic purposes, that somehow by the way in which it continues to be involved in funding and directing the World Bank, that somehow corrupts an international development process that ought to be more sensitive to particular country purposes. The other level of corruption is that sort of talked about, not always identified, and efforts to try and eradicate it coming on stream, the sense that international development is actually fraught with difficulty simply because of graft. And the way in which international development is or isn't moving forward is the result of money being pilfered by corrupt regimes, and that the World Bank is just simply fostering this on a continuing basis. Let's tackle the first one. In terms of dealing with the World Bank is basically just the puppet of the United States in terms of its foreign policy, and that it's corrupting international development ideals. you've seen the bank over an extended period from the Cold War right on through. How is the bank changing and how is international development changing in terms of the way in which the bank is working with it?
That's a great question. I think it's difficult to be a hegemon these days. Okay, the United States is still the world's largest economy. The United States is the most powerful country on earth by any measure, spending more than the next 25 countries combined on defense, and 24 of those 25 countries are allies of the United States. And some would argue making sure that no other country, even an ally, can even come close. At the same time, it's clear that in the global economy, the new actors have changed, and the forces of globalization have changed who is powerful in the world economy. That's not to say the United States is less powerful, but the United States is faced with other people who have powers that are maybe different, particularly China. The growth of China, and probably India, though less, to a much lesser extent, is primarily because of globalization and technology. I'm going to say technology in the broad sense, though one could argue that it's IT that's done it, because that offers the opportunity to do global supply chains, which we all see when we go to Target or to Walmart. So that the Chinese, China, a country that sort of ran its economy into the ground in the 50s and the 60s, has been able to make very fast progress to regain its role in the world to the point where it is the second largest economy now, just having recently overtaken Japan. Similarly, we are dealing with different trade blocs and political blocs, notably the European Union. So if you look at China, the European Union, the United States, you've got three roughly equal economies, which, compared to the way things were at the beginning of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, is very different. Now, the World Bank was set up as part of the Bretton Woods system at the end of World War II. It reflects the power balances of the world at the end of World War II, which don't exist anymore. And the people who own, the owners of the World Bank, which are every government in the world except except Cuba and North Korea, the owners of the World Bank have found it rather difficult to change the governance and operation of the World Bank to reflect the new realities of who has the money. And at a period when the World Bank is, I think, 0.5% of the capital flows into developing countries, 0.5%. When most of that capital is because of private foreign investment, because of remittances, because of countries investing in their neighbors. Well, what is the role of the World Bank? Well, an organization where the United States says, well, we're the biggest country, well, yes, you are, but still has veto power over changes in the Articles of Agreement. Not that that's a big deal. Where the Europeans have a whole lot of members of the board, even though, should Belgium and the Netherlands have a seat on the board? Okay, fine, they represent a number of other countries, but Belgium and the Netherlands, 8 European members sitting around a 25-member board, as 8 European members reflect the role of Europe in the global economy. Also, you have, in addition to China, you have Brazil and India and Russia and South Africa. Well, I'm of the school that says the BRICS have nothing in common except a name Goldman Sachs gave them a number of years ago. Discussed. But the power relationships within the world have changed. And while it may have been true when I joined the bank that Turkey should not have been getting as much money from the World Bank as it got, but Turkey was a very important friend of the United States. I don't think that's true today. I think the decisions about who's allowed to borrow from the World Bank are taken on the matter of, well, who's performing, who's delivering results, and not just with money the World Bank lends them or gives them. It's, what are you doing about growth? How are you empowering women? There are sort of metrics about all that. And in the allocation of money to countries, a lot of it is very performance-based. So that it's a lot different from where it was.
leads to two questions. I'll come back to the sort of corruption and graft on individual projects, but this notion of ethics taking on a slightly different cast in international development now sometimes bumps into this principle of non-interference in the sovereign affairs of the state. And so when you talk about gender issues or environmental concerns or other goals or objectives, how is the World Bank's priorities on that, what some people would consider an ethical or moral menu, if you will, dealt with in this context of you're not supposed to interfere where individual state interests are affected? China in particular is a classic case where do you even have a dialogue about human rights, and how can you engage that?
Well, I think it's fair to say nobody has a dialogue with China on human rights. And why would they listen to the World Bank? They're just a shareholder. You know, they want our money or they don't want our money. That said, the prohibition in the Articles of Agreement that the World Bank will not be involved in the domestic political affairs of its members has over the years been interpreted and reinterpreted in ways where it's quite different maybe from what the people sitting in the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire thought. The most significant change was for years the World Bank never used the word corruption. We can't talk about corruption, so we called it governance. Well, governance was the code word for corruption, and when you said governance, you meant corrupt. You immediately thought Nigeria. But eventually, there was a whole lot of evidence that corruption gets in the way of development. And, you know, you can quantify it. You can say, you know, how much does it cost to set up a business in Ukraine? Well, a business in Ukraine costs so much, Poland costs so much. Well, what's the difference? So you look at how many signatures do you have to get? How many forms do you have to fill out? And how much does it cost to get each of those signatures? Oh, that's interesting in Ukraine. Well, Ukrainians didn't really want to hear much about that, but we had a very diligent guy, so he published all of this in the bank. But then that methodology of, well, actually corruption costs became actually something you could prove and you could demonstrate internationally and sort of, all right, so what are the bases of corruption? Well, there's petty corruption, but there's petty corruption because of bureaucracy. Well, who wants a bigger bureaucracy? Most people don't. So that your entry to reducing corruption is by saying, if your government works more efficiently, then you will have better growth, and you will include more of your people in development. And, by the way, corruption will be harder, and therefore the money that's spent in your country will likely get for its intended purposes, and your roads will be better built, and you may be able to build more of them. And often governments, when presented with that, said, well, actually, we could fix that. Now, that creates a whole lot of issues for interests. Nonetheless, that quantitative approach, combined with the outrage that Jim Wolfenson expressed in the famous speech about corruption that he gave at the annual meetings in Hong Kong in 1998, created an impetus for the World Bank to get tough on it. So, yes, that's political interference, but we managed to bring in corruption. So then, well, what about governance? Well, you know, what do we, should we be telling governments how to organize their parliaments? Well, what do we know about that? There are other people who are better at that. At the same time, part of parliaments doing a better job is educating parliaments on what they should do. Well, hey, we could do that. So the World Bank, in partnership with others, has this parliamentary network of the World Bank, where parliamentarians are brought together to talk about what should we do in our role as parliamentarians in order to oversee government, to shape the planning process, to influence the development process. Again, that's an influence activity, but it has a political impact because people say, oh, I never thought of my role as a member of Congress to do that. I thought my role was to shut down government. Oh, really? Okay. So that, you know, so the boundaries of what's the bank going to be able to intervene in have been pushed. Now, human rights is an interesting one, and I know a bit about this, and what Paul said, I'd love to talk about it, so I did a little research. On January 27, 2006, General Counsel of the bank, Roberto Danino, who did not particularly get along with Paul Wolfowitz, the president of the World Bank at that time, as his boxes were being moved out of his office at 11:30, the last day of his employment, hit the button and issued a legal opinion about the World Bank and human rights, which was perhaps why his term was ending. And he said, I'm the general counsel. The general counsel of the World Bank has a particular role because the general counsel interprets the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank. And there's no sort of, you don't go somewhere else and get them interpreted. The general counsel does it. And the general counsel said, I thought this was particularly good, human rights may constitute legitimate considerations for the bank. You can imagine the shaking of the building. When they have some ramifications or impacts, when they have economic ramifications or impacts. And it confirms the facilitative role of the bank, that the bank may play in helping their members perform their international human rights obligations. And he turned off his computer and left. So that opens the door rather widely if you want to do it. So what does the bank do? Well, the big thing that we did is we started to do more work on community-driven development, which is a way of giving voice to the poorest people to say, this is what we need in our neighborhood. Well, give voice to poor people to say, well, we have a grant from the government, we'd like to build a road, we'd like to build a school. And there's a process for us to decide that. There are a lot of governments that really weren't very comfortable with that as a way of operating. The bank says, try it out, it'll work. And it did. There were some problems with it, but nonetheless, it worked. So that there's that aspect of it. In addition, the bank can use this to argue that this project carried out in this way may not allow you to comply with your rights with your obligations under international human rights conventions. And we should apply that standard when we're looking at something that may involve resettlements, or when we're looking at something that may have an impact on indigenous peoples, or when we're looking that you're a signatory to some international convention on the rainforest. So it gives us an opportunity, it gives the bank, I keep saying us, I apologize, I'm just retired, but after 37 years, bad habits. It gives the bank the opening. In my view, the bank should move through that opening carefully more often, because in terms of gaining international support and actually dealing with poverty, that may be the way to do it. Because who are the poorest? Poorest are the people that are excluded. They're the old, they're the disabled, they're people who live in marginal areas. They're people who are denied their rights. Well, what are their rights? Well, they may be human rights, they may be legal rights, they may be economic rights. But I think there's a lot of scope, particularly if the bank is going to be transformative, for the World Bank to take more advantage of that. Not to say we shouldn't do all those other things like dams and roads and things we do really well, but that human rights lens could probably, in some countries, give us considerable scope to do a better job.
Which is a neat segue into talking about dams, resettlement, and Richard Gere.
Okay. All right.
Did you like that?
I like that.
In
I like that.
sequence. So why does Richard Gere matter to the World Bank?
Well, Richard Gere matters to the World Bank because it was a project, I think it was in 1999 when the fans started to read. The Chinese government has had a remarkable success at eradicating poverty in marginal areas. It really has been impressive. And they had a formula for doing it. And it was a lot of rural development, irrigation, land use. And over the years, they've done a really good job of sort of moving down that central part of China that's very dry and bringing new economic opportunities to people in areas that were pretty marginal. Someday somebody's going to write the environmental impact discussion of that, but let's put that aside for the moment. In 1999, China was faced with its last loan, its last operation financed by IDA, which is the poor country window. China had been a blend country for many years, but the bank eventually said, hey, look, you're doing a pretty good job on poverty. We really should be giving you money that should go to Africa, India, and then to Africa and others. You're too rich. But we'd love to do one of these anti-poverty programs, the Western China Poverty Project. Great. So they proceeded with this, and the Chinese are really good at doing these projects, and they had a resettlement component and all this. And shortly before the project was going to go to be considered by our executive directors, the Tibet lobby got very, very involved. And the world is treated to Richard Gere and the Tibet Freedom, one of the Tibet NGOs, saying the World Bank is encouraging genocide by financing the Western China Poverty Project. Well, we don't like World Bank and genocide used in the same sentence. Okay, what's the story here? Well, it turned out that there was a part of the project in an area where if you got the traditional map of Tibet, that sort of overlapped into that province. Okay, so we say to the country office, what do you know about this? The bank management says to the country office, what do you know about this? And they said, who's Richard Gere? You know, you tend to live somewhere, you may not be watching CNN all the time, but even in '99, not everybody watched CNN. So it's sort of, well, who's Richard Gere? Well, Richard Gere is making it sort of difficult to go ahead with this. And we have Representative Pelosi, who has just put in the Pelosi amendment that says we're not going to vote for any project that interferes with, I think she said human rights, and this was one of the ones that was on her list. And China's saying this is our last IDA project. We want this project, and we will do this. We will look after it. And how dare you interfere? How dare you interfere? So the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, was very unhappy because he doesn't like World Bank and genocide and Jim Wolfenson being used in the same sentence. And in fact, I had to do something with him the night before. He was doing a tape of something for me. I had to go and collect him in his office. He spent the whole day with the China team. He was not happy. In addition, he was getting the flu, and he was about to get on his airplane to go somewhere, so it was not pretty. So I said the next morning to my successor on China, well, you know, when we used to do project when I worked on China, we had a map, and we sort of brought the map to the office when we were we went into the meeting room when we were having a discussion of doing a project. And if Tibet was anywhere near the project, we didn't do it. You know, so what happened? Didn't I leave the map in the office? And what'd you do with it? And he said, well, you know, it's sort of tricky. And you know, I said, yeah, it is tricky, and it's on CNN. So the board was very split because this is June, end of the fiscal year, and it's China's last IDA project. What are we going to do? And the United States had said, we are not going to vote for this. And by this time, Richard Gere, you know, CNN International, the European governments were saying, what's going on here? What's the World Bank doing with Tibet? And the Tibet lobbyists in Washington were very good. And the bank was not very good. And we really couldn't prove anything. Like there had been studies done about who was affected. And it turned out, if you dug into the set of studies, yes, there were some Tibetan herders that came periodically to graze their animals in the area where the project was going to operate. Well, what do we know about them? Did we consult with them? Well, we don't consult with them. Did the Chinese government consult with them? No evidence. Well, were they there when the consultations took place? Probably not. They were with their herd somewhere else. So what are we going to do? We have China, big country, big lending program, and we have the other owners of the bank saying, China, big country, Tibetans, disputes human rights. It did not look as if a solution would be found. So the Chinese said, well, we would point out, and the bank said, all right, we'll come back, redo, we'll have more consultations, and we'll look at the resettlement issues related to the people in this province, because we didn't want to use the word Tibet, not vis-a-vis the Chinese, but the people in this province, we need to have a look at this, and there'll be a time limit, and then we'll go ahead with it, and they'll only disperse against that province when this is resolved. And the Chinese said, thank you very much. We have done enough studies for our own purposes, and we do not need the money for that province. And we want the project loan with that part of it taken out. So there's $100 million of a $300 million loan. We don't need that $100 million. We'll do it ourselves without the help of the World Bank. At this point, a whole lot of people said, yay, including Richard Gere. And other people said, yeah, that means they're going to do it by themselves, according to their own resettlement plan, which we haven't really seen, and doesn't have the word Tibetans in it. Chinese said, take it or leave it. And because the human rights part had been sort of punted and actually taken right off the table because the Chinese were going to do it themselves, the project proceeded. So I don't know whether the Tibetans were better off. Probably not. Maybe not worse off, but the involvement of the World Bank offers the opportunity in areas where you do have issues of disadvantaged groups to say, look, we have a standard here, and you need to do the studies to a standard that we accept, that you understand how people's livelihoods can be protected, and you have a plan that's credible for making sure that they're made whole and they're put into situations that are at least as good as the ones that were affected by whatever was built. But by saying, okay, Tibet all or nothing, that opportunity to influence China, to the extent that that's that's really true. And in '99, did China care about their image? Did they need the seal of approval from the World Bank? Yes, the Tibetans were looked after. I'm not sure. But that's an area where the bank, rightly in my opinion, yielded to international pressure about vis-a-vis a country that really does what it wants. And indeed, they're a powerful country. They're a smart country, and they do actually a lot of things quite well.
Two more questions, then I'm going to throw it open to the group. One actually goes back on an inward look at the bank and draws on some of the things we were talking about in the last hour on ethics in large organizations. So you've got these outward concerns about the organization's policies and procedures and engagement with stakeholders externally. I want to take an inward look because you have responsibility in terms of that internal oversight in an organization that often gets accused of having lots of opportunity, if not lots of action, on corruption from amongst its own staff.
Right.
Its own staff, its own country officers. Working in a large, multi-headed hydra of an international organization with people coming from different cultures, backgrounds, experiences, how do you end up inculcating an ethical culture in an international organization? I mean, you had very direct and long experience in this in different ways. What were some of at least the key factors for you at least when you were trying to sort out how to inculcate change and also to maintain an ethical standard?
I could talk for hours on that. It's hard. You have in place, the bank, the World Bank is a corporation like any other. So you have your internal controls, you have your accounting systems, you have your accounting rules, you have your staff rules, about discrimination and harassment. There are consequences for people that are brought up on those issues. The consequences are perhaps not implemented the same way as they would be in a U.S. corporation where, you would have half an hour to pick your box and you'd be escorted from the building. But nonetheless, there are rules. Where it gets tricky is when you get down to staff working in a country office in a country where the language really doesn't have a word for conflict of interest. When, of course, you tell your relatives where there might be a World Bank project coming from because they might want to buy land nearby. Well, no, you don't do that when you work for the World Bank. Why is that? Would you want to help your family? And that's hard. And there is a code of staff conduct. And there is training, often very tailored to the country where the training is going on, where our staff are mainly local. About, well, what does this mean in our country? And how hard is it for you to do that? And you do hear stories where there isn't really a massive slip up that leads to some embarrassment for the bank, but where local staff, it's mainly local staff, don't see how they can possibly do this and still be members of their family or their tribe. And that has somewhat more serious implications because there are many countries, and I sort of single out Africa, but I think it's true in other parts of the world, where if you get a job at the World Bank, you're firmly in the middle class. You're well paid, you have a nice job, you work in a nice air-conditioned office, you get to go to meetings, you get to be the sort of Sherpa in dealing with your international colleagues' arrival and sort of what just happened in that meeting. And international colleagues who don't take advantage of that are really stupid, in my opinion. That you show this respect to your local colleagues, they know what's going on in the meeting and you don't. But once they're in the middle class, they have this nice job at the World Bank, how likely are they to speak up against a manager who doesn't want to hear something? Because they might get fired. And if you get fired, all the nieces and nephews and cousins and brothers-in-law and all this that you support don't have that support anymore. And to me, that was always the big question. And there were a couple of situations where, the bank was accused of something, then the inspection panel went in. And the local people in the office said, yeah, we knew that project manager was a crook. And we tried to mention it, but the person we mentioned to got so angry, we just stopped talking about it, and because we were afraid of being fired and losing what we have. Now that may be true in every organization, but it even happens in Washington. If you're a foreigner and you come to work for the World Bank, you get a G4 visa, which, when you leave the bank, you have 60 days to regularize your visa situation within the United States. If you have come with your spouse and your children, you have left your middle career position in your home country, and you've come to the World Bank, and you want to take a stand on something, but you're afraid your boss is going to say, I don't really want to hear that, and you have a term contract for 5 years, are you going to speak up? Because they could just say, we're not going to renew your contract. Oh, it has nothing to do with the fact that you made a to-do about this, or that the vice president really didn't like what you had to say. But the consequences for a foreigner, and most of the World Bank staff are not Americans, to open their mouths and risk that visa status, which means they have 60 days to leave the country, having pulled up all their roots. That, to me, was always what it led to, a lack of candor that was really necessary to do things that were truly transformative, because it created, in small groups of staff, in times of extreme danger to the bank, it did not enhance the kind of trust that's needed if you're going to do really great work. And somebody put it, they did an organization, McKinsey was brought in to help with the reorganization, did this organizational health survey, and managers were allowed, this was just before I retired, we big poster thing, and we walked around this big conference room at a hotel and looked at all these posters. And somebody had written, like this badly done form, like everything McKinsey does. But it was right in part, and someone says, the World Bank is a big village, but it's not so big, and you don't want to have enemies in the village. And that, to me, I don't think I saw a lot of fear, and I never much worried about it. I'm a Canadian, but I never much worried. But I think that why don't people speak up? We're paid really well, we're really smart. There are processes for this. There are processes for whistleblowing. People don't seem to take advantage of that. And then when it comes out later, well, who knew about this? Well, we were afraid to say something. And I don't think you can run an organization that way, particularly one that has such high values and is such a recipient of the global public trust as the World Bank is. There's something that needs to be fixed. And my hope is that Dr. Kim will figure out a way to get past that.
I've got one more question on global innovation, but I'm conscious of our time, so I wanted to actually throw it open. Paul's had experience in Central and Eastern Europe, 11 years, I believe, with responsibility in West Africa, in all sorts of different countries. So open it up to any questions that anybody has at this stage, either about his career, his experience, ethical compass, or the experience at the World Bank during that period.
A quick clarification and a question. When you were speaking about China and the Tibet controversy, I wanted to clarify. It meant that the World Bank then funded still
two provinces where there were no Tibetans.
Right. So I guess my commentary is that seems odd to separate, as if to me the question is, without the World Bank funding, would the project have gone forward? So that's one question. And then, but I really also wanted you to address the issue of corporate ethics, which you haven't touched on, which is the decision of the bank to start funding private enterprises as well, and the controversies around that. So just a few thoughts on that.
Well, the projects as large as what are done in China are generally the responsibility of provincial governments. So there are 3 provinces. And the Chinese said, the central government said, we will fund the central government share in that province with our own money, because it was part of a national program. So the World Bank's money will only be devoted to those other 2 projects, and we'll cut out the money for the 3rd project. So in China's a country where China's never really needed the money from the World Bank. And we were there to help them make it better and do it better. But China never had a balance of payments problem, foreign exchange problem. So, yeah, they went ahead with it. The question of the World Bank, the private sector, the World Bank's been, the World Bank Group, that is IFC, has been lending and investing in the private sector since around 1960. some would argue that, like, and they have a very different culture from the people who say our dream is a world free of poverty. They're sort of investment bankers, if you will. They're quite risk averse. When I was in Afghanistan for 5 days, the most interesting 5 days of my entire career, the IFC, there was an IFC mission there, their 20th, and IFC had not invested in one Afghan enterprise. If there'd been a luxury hotel, I'm sure IFC would have been right in there, but so we can't really find the right thing. Well, why is that? Well, there isn't an investment climate. Well, okay, that's World Bank, it's the government's business, World Bank helps. But if an international development organization isn't there to take risks, you have to sort of look at, well, why is it? Well, maybe all the potential investors are corrupt. That actually was sort of my sense, that, yeah, there was a lot of private sector activity going on without IFC, and it had a funny smell as you drove through the city. And, you know, you had the poppy trade, you had security issues, so a foreign investor to come in and work with a local investor was probably unlikely at that point. But the whole issue of leveraging the World Bank's funds against the private sector is a question of, well, in aid of what? And what does private sector mean? Does private sector mean the Gates Foundation? Well, I'm sure we all love to work more with Gates Foundation and other philanthropies. But when the private sector is, you know, Total wanting to finance health centers in Angola, that sounds like greenwashing to me. And there were some of us who actually did say, we're not going to, like, you're going to structure this deal so that it's fine that Total gets reports, but they're not coming to put their sign on things. And we're not going to let them come and see how things are going. We're going to report them. Because it's not their business to be telling the government of Angola, which they would have the opportunity to do if they came along on the mission. They want to do philanthropy, that's fine. There's a limit to philanthropy. But even that was quite controversial. And finally, Total came along. I had to dig my heels in for about 8 months, and the legal department supported me. But that, you know, you do get into that when you work with the private sector. And the bank needs to come up with the mechanisms to make sure that we're not sort of letting the private sector in and sanitizing themselves and their money, if we're going to do more work with them, which I believe the World Bank and the whole development community needs to do. Thank you for your question.
Sir.
My question or my comment is about the World Bank and the IMF post the financial crisis, post the euro crisis. There has been a lot of debate about the World Bank and the IMF. I know that maybe the World Bank entered with something related to Greece, I think the IFC.
We apparently gave some advice to Greece,
yes,
along with the IMF and the European Central Bank.
Yeah, so there was that, I think, in the Financial Times debate commentary about stakeholders, China, Brazil, a lot of countries had not a dissent, but basically were asking about the policies such as worldwide institutions, which have many stakeholders, as you pointed out. How do they set? How do you have a policy which everybody agrees by? And we saw, like my observation, because I'm interested in such stuff. I've seen a lot of bickering about even in the U.S. The U.S. had well, we're putting money to the IMF, we're putting money to the World Bank, and this is going to debt countries with debt over 100% of GDP, and we have our own debt problems to manage. So how could you, are these institutions post the realization of 2008, 2009, can function in the same manner in light of the scrutiny, in light of open transparency, knowing, like you talked about Turkey, helping Greece, why did not Cyprus had a similar problem? We didn't see that same intervention. So I think, if I can get your input post 2008, post 2009, how can you see such an institution function in a manner which all stakeholders will be pleased?
Well, I don't think in any public organization all the stakeholders are ever all pleased. There's a whole body of knowledge in international relations about how decisions get taken. And it's sort of, the least worst and, who has a veto and can we make sure they don't use it. I think you're absolutely right that the financial crisis and its resolution changed a whole lot of the game. We don't know for sure how that's going to end. A friend of mine, a former journalist at the Washington Post, in fact, has just written a book about the role of the IMF and the Financial Stability Forum. And I think, the IMF, the Financial Stability Forum, which is coming out this week, about what was actually going on. And he was supposed to come to Washington and there was going to be a book party at the World Bank, which after 6 weeks, the World Bank declined to host the book party. Because the IMF, and it was never really why, but the sense was, we really don't want a book party at the beginning of the annual meetings about a book that's critical about the IMF and uses a number of confidential documents, which were kindly given to the journalist, to describe what was actually going on. Now, I haven't read the book. I think it's being published today. So my partner, who is the Associate Dean for Government Procurement at George Washington University Law School, arranged with his associate, the Associate Dean for International Law, International Affairs Law, that George Washington University will host the book party. And it is like the World Bank and the IMF, the IMF, World Bank's over here, George Washington University Law School is on the next block. So it's going to get out there. I think that, when the history is written of the global financial crisis and we sort of figure out, well, what had to be done in order to avert something none of us wanted to think of, there'll be a lot of second guessing, quarterbacking, that never should have happened. All right, if it hadn't happened, what would have happened? But it also, the rebalancing of the global economy, the growth of inequality within industrialized countries, I think does create a huge, it changes the bully pulpit that the IMF has in particular. It changes the role of the European Central Bank and the European Commission vis-a-vis Europe. In Greece, and sort of Greece brings down the euro, I don't think so. Well, yeah, it could have, but nobody thought of that. So that when the history is written, we're going to find out that international relations has changed, and not just because the money's in different places.
That's actually an interesting point at which to draw the conversation to a close. I invite you, actually, I'm going to set up with Paul at McGeorge House. We'll have coffee available if those of you who want to have one-on-one discussions with Paul.
Or small group.
Or small group. Has kindly made himself available for the afternoon, so we'll be there for the next hour. Please, though, thank Paul for joining us at McGeorge today for a discussion about ethics and how you've seen it change over the course of a career at a fascinating time in the development of our world.